Hello everybody, this is For the Masses podcast. I'm here with my friend Vijay Keshav. A word of warning to everyone, he might say something quite controversial, he often does. That's just the nature of Vijay, you'll get used to it. But he's, say hello Vijay.
Hi, yeah, I'm Vijay, you know that.
Yeah, if anyone knows Vijay, you'll know Vijay. Okay, today we're going to be talking about lockdown, and sort of the core point is whether we think it's justified. We'll get to that at the end. We thought we might sort of take this as an incremental approach. I thought the first sort of question that comes to mind in this situation is about experts. I think that often with this discussion there is a tendency to think about experts as the only people potentially qualified to talk about it. So we heard this very often at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was this whole talk about, for example, scientists are the ones who make who are key in making the political decision and advising the government, and the government should listen to them. I was thinking about potentially drawing that up as the first point of which we want to focus on. Vijay, what are your opinions about this?
Yeah, I think it's a full issue. I mean, obviously there was a lot of expert talk around Brexit, but I think the first thing I'd like to point out is that the word is used, I think, very boldly, and I'm not sure that reflects the true state of affairs. So when we talk about experts, I think it's worth getting clear on what we're actually talking about, and I think the first thing to point out is that, especially when we bring up scientists, as though there's some kind of unified body, what actually went on in terms of the government receiving advice from scientists was they received various different modelling hypotheses from various different groups of scientists, all of which predicted different outcomes and, crucially, with varying probabilities in terms of varying possible strategies. So I think the first thing to do is we should be aware that when we're talking about expert debate, it isn't as simple as do we listen to experts or not. Experts, I think, is a misleading term. What we really have is a series of qualified professionals who have radically different opinions and whose opinions are often going to be qualified by lots of things. So I think that's the first thing to say about expert talk in general.
I think that's a very sensible approach to take. I think that often, especially, I think you raise a good point in the fact that often the experts have disagreements within themselves as well, which often mean that sort of it's quite hard to sort of take a generic expert approach to a particular point of policy, like, because there's so many different expert approaches to it. So I mean, if you're hearing about the Great Barrington Declaration against lockdowns in general, like, that is a radically different approach from a lot of other scientists that say that lockdowns, for example, are the best way to control things. So I mean, like, potentially, I mean, you're right. I think that the idea of this scientific consensus that exists and we've got to follow it, for one, it's certainly a misnomer because the scientific consensus doesn't exist. I think it's also worth thinking about the fact that experts, I think that potentially it's worth thinking about the fact that, like, experts in what? Because you've got obviously scientific experts, but this is not just a scientific approach, and not just sort of the decisions are not just being made off the models. There, of course, is a trade-off that exists as well. You've got different sorts of experts that we need to talk to when making a political decision here. So, I mean, I think there's lots to dig into.
Yeah, I think especially interesting in terms of lockdown, obviously, is that the science was statistical modelling, and I mean, I'm not myself a scientist, but knowing scientists, they tend to frown on the discipline because it offers predictions that are it offers nothing but predictions, and the outcome of the model hugely depends on the variables that are included. So we might, I think, specifically talking about lockdown, want to be sceptical of what experts painted as this kind of body have to say, not least because they're kind of a disparate group, but more importantly because the kind of evidence, the kind of claims that experts in statistical modelling can make should carry much less weight, and I think do carry much less weight than general scientific proclamations.
No, I think you've made quite a convincing case there. I think that yeah, I do agree with you in terms of experts. I think that as I was saying, I mean, like, maybe the claim and the discussion that I was talking about is a slightly different sort of discussion than you. Is the idea that what the government's message was back in March is that we're following the advice of the experts, and that for some reason is sort of one monolithic statement, and it doesn't feel as if that's right necessarily at all, because there is this necessary disagreement. There are all these different diverging opinions, and what's more, it's not just the case that it's a public health issue, it's also an issue of public and government policy as well. So I think you've got multiple trade-offs that we're not considering, and I mean, like, I suppose there's different aspects of this expert talk. Yeah.
Do you think there's been some kind of passing off of blame in that sense? I mean, you'd been following the politics more closely. It seems as though the politicians are blaming the scientists the politicians, and it's general pass the parcel game with the kind of the consequences of lockdown. Do you think that's something which has been exacerbated under lockdown?
I think you're right, and I think that part of the problem is, and this is why I think this is an interesting discussion, is that there have been accusations. I know there was accusations in Ireland, but also within sort of the British special advisor world, of advisors, political advisors as well. There has been a lot of accusation that potentially the experts or the scientists, let's call them specifically scientific advisors, don't have to bear the brunt of decisions, of the political consequences, political and social long-term consequences if they're wrong, whereas they do have to be responsible if, for example, coronavirus kills a hell of a lot more people than they actually predicted. So I think there tends to be a bias towards sort of treating, within sort of these medical advisory groups, towards treating the evidence and prioritising evidence relating to public health matters over everything else, or at least that's the criticism within certain forms of government. I know that the TSERT, I can never say his name, but the Irish equivalent of the Prime Minister basically accused his scientific advisory body of not having the same sort of responsibility that the government does. So I think there's sort of two aspects of this. First of all, potentially this idea that there is scientific consensus, which I think is false, but also the particular incentives that certain form of advisory bodies are under in order to behave in a particular way and in order to give certain forms of advice. It tends to be that SAGE in the UK has been pressurising the government to go further than the government has gone, and as a result it has never been wrong medically, but maybe it has done things which economically and socially are highly consequential.
Yeah, I think it's obviously difficult to ask scientists to move beyond their area of expertise, and I mean, you know, if you ask a dentist, they won't want you to eat apples, despite I think that might be an analogy more broadly for the way in which science has been used in the lockdown process, is that certain groups who have specific interests have been prioritising those interests potentially to the detriment of a kind of more holistic picture.
Yeah.
Although I think it is obviously important to be very clear about what I'm criticising, what I take you to be criticising as well, which is not the validity of the science as much as the extension of its scope, because there have, of course, been, I think still are, lots of conspiracy theories floating around. Some of them are true, obviously, some of them are false. But they often seem to be just ignoring the scientific claims. I don't think that's what I'm trying to. I hope it's not what you're trying to say either.
Yeah, I think potentially we can move on to the second element of this discussion, which I think is talking about potentially the relative upsides and the relative downsides of lockdown, and whether lockdown as a policy can first of all be justified in the specific cases of the lockdowns which we've experienced, and then just more generally, I think, sort of as a philosophical / political concept, can we ever justify that level of state infringement? I think that we break that down. Potentially we look at, for example, I think the first lockdown. Do you think the first lockdown was justified?
Well, I think the first lockdown was potentially ill-timed. I think if it was justified, I would say the justification came from a kind of urgency and a kind of lack of culpability. So, I mean, obviously, I think it's fairly clear, will become clear that I'm philosophically quite anti-lockdown. I think a possible way of defending lockdown, especially the first lockdown, was to say, look, this thing came out of nowhere for everybody, and maybe the government made some bad choices, but it isn't clear that they were the worst choices, and it isn't clear that they had good reason to be making better choices. So I think in terms of the first lockdown, what it might be worth putting out there is the fact that I don't think we necessarily need a perfect justification, or even anything more than kind of a reason to believe that what the government thought they were doing was broadly good. Because
So I think that the way in which conceptualising the first crisis and thinking about why that first crisis was justified, I think the way in which we need to think about that is that I don't think we knew very much at all about the virus. I don't think we knew very much at all about the virus. And it could have potentially been massively consequential to the future of our nation, with so many people dying, as had been predicted by several or many scientists. It had been estimated, some estimates estimated that it would roughly sort of 3% fatality rate or even higher. That was really significant at the time. I think that given that information and the potential for that being the case, I think that a good case can be made that at the very least we needed to prevent it from getting out of hand and causing that, and being able to, and we should, with that added time, be able to sort of better understand the virus, but not only better understand the virus, also increase our capacity, increase the capacity of hospitals, increase our sort of ability to test, increase our ability to recruit doctors, etc., to sort of create a more flexible and effective response to the virus in the future. So I think there were multiple reasons why I think it was probably the right thing to do for Boris to lock down. I mean, obviously we can get into the specifics of if he locked down too late, because he probably did. But I mean, like, I think that broadly as a policy, lockdown was justified.
yeah, I mean, I think an excellent example is the Nightingale hospitals, right? Because I think people at the time, when they were sitting unused, there were a lot of complaints that saying, why waste the money on this? Why do this? Why that? Do the other? Why do the other? But I think if we see it with terms of flexibility and uncertainty, they make a lot more sense. It was an investment that didn't pan out, but not having had it, I think, would be much worse than the money and labour they did spend on constructing it. And I think we can extend that point more broadly across the first lockdown, but it is worth noting that as a kind of key example. Now, personally, I don't think the first lockdown was justified anyway, but I think that there could have been more done earlier, especially in terms of communicating with the public honestly and with expressing kind of first and foremost the ignorance the government had. but in terms of practical effects, I think you could very convincingly claim that policy-wise, if we grant that lockdowns are permissible in general, this was the right move in that circumstance, given, ignorance and a need to sort of accommodate potential worst-case scenarios, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think potentially, I think, however, even though I think our heart was in the right place and we are we were thinking correctly, I think that broadly a broader point could be made about sort of the lack of bravery and effectiveness in our bravery in our political culture, and the lack of ability to be flexible with our political culture, because I think that even though there were these attempts to, for example, build the Nightingale hospitals and to do a whole load of other things with a whole load of other things that increased our ability to react against future health crises, I don't think that we actually used our resources. We pumped necessarily enough into that sort of project. I think that, for example, it would be eminently sensible in a public health crisis, for example, to allow to invest a hell of a lot of money in building new facilities like Nightingale hospitals in order to prepare for the worst case scenario if this disease is so bad. But I think that generally in British political culture and Western political culture, there's this idea that potentially that money is going to be wasted. When if you look at the amount of money we spent on Nightingale hospitals and fast tracking some doctors to actually become doctors, relative to the amount of money that we spent on the furlough scheme, it's incomparable. We spent so much on the furlough scheme. It cost us so much in terms of GDP for the furlough scheme, and not having a working economy for about 6 months. That I think that we could have done a lot better with that. So that's my one qualification.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's a lot of it was a case of underinvestment in certain schemes. I'll agree with you, but I think we aren't yet sufficiently informed economically to say whether or not more expenditure is better. I think both of us are keenly aware that we're going to be moving into a recession in terms of the jobs market, right? I don't think we yet have enough information really about what it's going to look like for us personally, and indeed for the rest of the country. I think that was something that it later might transpire that in fact this was a massive case of overspending by the government, and the consequences of the recession are much worse and much more long lasting. So I'd be wary, I think, of making these kind of economic claims about spending more, spending less,
Yeah.
in lieu of that evidence, which will come, hopefully, but unfortunately, in the years to come.
A thought that has come to me recently, I think that this, moving on to sort of the lockdown that we're now in, is this idea of the concept of lockdown is itself quite interesting. I think that we're quite keen to think about, for example, we are either in lockdown or not lockdown, and obviously there was this whole thing about the Prime Minister moving back into lockdown. Do you think that there was this whole thing about moving back into lockdown, where that wasn't necessarily that different, for example, from Tier 3 restrictions that were going on across a lot of the urban area across the country? Do you think that the idea of lockdown is sort of this actually makes sense in the fact that, do you think it is qualitatively different from other sorts of restrictions placed on the country? For example, with tier 3 restrictions,
Yeah.
etc. And do you think this sort of, and do you think that having conceptualized it in this way, I think that, I mean, it makes a lot. I think that there's sort of this binariness of the debate about whether to go into lockdown or not, which sort of simplifies it quite significantly, where it need not be simplified. Do you agree with that, or do you not get what I'm saying?
No, I think that's absolutely the case. I think again, I mean, what I think I've seen from various news sources, a massive case of optics when it comes to the kind of government response, and so lockdown, I think, is the buzzword, and I think it's interesting for a bunch of reasons, but I absolutely agree. I think it kind of clouds an issue where there's much more granularity, there's a kind of greater distinction, but also similarity between the various states of lockdownness, rather than, I think, lockdown or not. And I think I saw Nigel Farage started to found some new political party.
Yeah.
As he seems every few years he doesn't get
every few weeks.
Well, every few weeks. Yes. And that runs on the idea that, you know what, we should segregate is a loaded term. I think it's also very applicable. We should segregate the vulnerable and let the rest of us get on with our lives. That's a kind of lockdown, you know. So I think it's important to note that the far other end of the spectrum to the lockdown we're seeing now, this kind of Faragian approach, which I've heard about from many different sources, is still a lockdown. I think it will be a much harsher lockdown indeed on this minority of the vulnerable than it would be than it is currently for all of us. But I think that goes to illustrate this point. There is a disparity between the claims that are made, lockdown or not, and the way things actually are in terms of the restrictions that are or are not imposed upon various different groups.
Yeah, I think that one of the most interesting things about it is that when it fell in Italy at the very start of the pandemic, I think the fact that the Italians set that precedent of this really harsh, really restrictive set of laws that basically disallowed you from going out of your house unless you had some sort of note from the government. I think that set a precedent for, and it was a precedent learnt from China, but it was the first democracy to actually sort of create that sort of model of what it was to respond to a pandemic. And I think that really crystallized in everyone's mind what this lockdown was. And I think it's a real shame, actually, that it hit Italy at the time that it did, in the way that it did, because I feel as if potentially, if, for example, it hit Germany and there was a slightly more measured approach, as would later become the case in Germany, then potentially, I think democracies, or measured and targeted approach, I think that democracies across the West would be far more likely to follow sort of a slightly different, less harsh, more nuanced model.
And I think actually, I mean, obviously, you know me, I'm a philosopher. I'm inclined to take these to abstract levels. But I think what's interesting for me is this idea of targeting, because we talk about harsh or you know, not harsh lockdowns. I don't think that is the key there, but I think the variable we're talking about, the kind of key thing is targeting. Because sure, a lockdown can be more permissive or less permissive, but I think the key kind of other variable people don't talk about at all is this idea of targeting. I'm at university right now, right? So I'm in a sense less targeted by this lockdown than I was by the first, because obviously universities are still allowed to be open. Key workers were less targeted than the general populace in the first and in the second lockdowns. My mother's a doctor; she was still off to work, albeit in a reduced capacity, during the lockdowns. And I think this is the idea people don't discuss, and I think that's what Farage's party. I have qualms about the whole idea, but nevertheless, there it is. What he's essentially saying is, look, let's change the targets of our restrictions. I wonder what you thought about that as a kind of concept that isn't really discussed, probably should be.
What, targeting specifically? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that this idea of one of the I think least by far convincing arguments against targeting is that it's some form of discrimination, be it ageism or otherwise. I read that one. I read that sort of in a serious scientific journal the other day, and I almost burst out laughing because I think that ultimately, if it's a question of lives, and you're cordoning off the people who are quite clearly vulnerable from dying of this, that is certainly not discrimination. I think that it's certainly the case that yes, the targeted approach is the right one. I think that what's more, I think that what this pandemic, more than anything, has been slowly increasing our ability to target well, because I think that at the very start, like, for whatever reason, I think the British state was quite poor at targeting. I don't think it had the capacities and processes in place, potentially from austerity, but I don't necessarily think it's just austerity. I think it's also an attitude and, to some extent, the degree of centralisation at the centre of the British state. I think it's a lot of things, the political culture, I think it's a lot of things, and also our lack of national cohesion and sense of identity, because I think that Sweden, for example, that had a strong sense of identity, is far more willing to listen to and think about direct orders in a way, or national cohesion in a way that we're not. So I think that it's slowly been moving towards targeting, that being through test and trace, the tier system, etc., creating institutions and processes which are able to target more effectively. And I think that potentially that's where I think Boris might have been taken a step back in the wrong direction by going into this second lockdown, because I think that is a move away from effective targeting, because I think there is some evidence that the levelling off of the coronavirus cases happened before Boris actually announced that a second lockdown was in place, and tier 3 restrictions and tier 2 restrictions actually did quite a lot to prevent the spread of the pandemic. So I agree with you. I think we want to potentially move... Do you want to respond quickly? Yeah.
Yeah, jump in. I don't think I agree targeting is important. I just don't take your same stance on it. I think targeting is in the sense that you're describing it, I think is just a violation of some liberties that I think we should be more careful before we let go. Especially your description of kind of information targeting through track and trace. I think I have strong moral intuitions that's a bad thing. I think they stem, a lot of them, from the fact that we haven't yet considered the importance of information and the kind of information we're giving away. Luckily now to the government rather than through third-party contractors in the same way is should be very concerning. I think the issue, right, when it always comes down to questions of targeting, is one of responsibility. It seems that I'm okay to imprison a murderer because in some sense they deserve this imprisonment. They're a legitimate target, and that is in virtue of some kind of moral violation, or potentially cashed out in terms of some kind of threat they pose. It's unclear how any given individual in a tier 3 zone, or a given individual who is kind of participating in the track and trace system, fulfills either criteria. They definitely haven't done anything wrong, and it seems as though whether or not they are harmful depends entirely on whether or not they have the disease. And targeting as it is operating now targets those people who do not have the disease, either kind of accidentally, incidentally through tier 3 zones, and this idea of an area or a zone which is locked down, or through track and trace because the majority of participants won't have the virus.
This offers me a chance of a very smooth transition, actually, because I was going to move on to the morality of lockdown more generally. but it feels as if we've moved in that direction anyway. I think this is where I disagree, and I have thought about this, is I think that the role of liberties, as you've described them, I don't buy into that. I think that there is a place for liberties, and of course there is a place for human rights and set freedoms, but I think that the way in which we need to conceptualise sort of government more generally is that it works in the best interests of society, and whatever is defined as the best interest of society has to be defined in the specific case. So I think that, for example, in this, if there is a really, really terrible virus, and the only way is to do something which directly contravenes a set of liberties, which you find to be inalienable. Let's say it's not even this virus, it's a virus with a 50% mortality rate, which is also highly infectious, and it's rapidly spreading. I think that in that case, I think it's quite hard to see why it would not be in the best interests of society more generally to think about combating that in an indiscriminate way that violates people's notional freedoms, because it's not just in their best interest. It's government is ultimately sort of an attempt by government in a democratic society is ultimately an attempt by government to work in people's best interests.
I think I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think it's worth though drawing this kind of distinction, which we may or may not get from Rousseau, between kind of and talking about what the people would want, a kind of general ideal will.
Yeah.
And this is why I have sympathy with the first lockdown, but not any sympathy at all really with the second. And I think it's because by the time of the second lockdown, the government should have been able to discern the general will, discern the fact that actually the virus is not incredibly harmful, and that the potential harms from going into lockdowns exceed the harms of the virus. I think the reason why your counter-argument doesn't work is because in the 50% death rate case, I think absolutely general will and coercive government strategy line up. And the reason I think the first lockdown would be justified in this model is because we didn't have any idea really what was going on, and therefore the government, I think, is perfectly legitimate for the government to take actions before they can discern what the appropriate general will might be, what the ideal choice would be, and then in the future it might turn out that was incorrect. But if it wasn't genuinely likely they could discern what the correct course of action was, but had to choose a course of action anyway, they are culpable, right, for the potential error. But in this second lockdown instance, I think it's perfectly clear, at the very least evidenced by the fact we're having this discussion right now, that there is no clear indication that a lockdown is a good thing. A lockdown is the thing that people kind of, in an idealised sense of people, want. And because of this, not justified for the government to go into one now.
I mean, I think that maybe I slightly misunderstood you about, for example, I thought your point more generally was a libertarian one about we have these inalienable rights which the government can't take away with us. I think I do broadly, I think, agree with you in many respects. I think that we should conceptualise this first of all primarily in regard to the general will. I'm not sure how you do in terms of sort of the Rousseauian argument that we're acting for the whole people, and that sort of in sort of an imagined idealised vision of what they would want if they were thinking if everyone was thinking rationally what would be best for the national community as a whole. I think that we all also probably broadly agree that what we do need is that potentially the lockdown that has just happened might not be the best response, but we do need some sort of restrictions, but these restrictions are more granular and nuanced and sort of more in line with the tier system than a full-scale lockdown. So I think that broadly we might actually agree, and I might have misunderstood your argument very slightly.
Well, I think a tier system, I obviously, I mean, I don't think tier system is, well, I think tier system is bad to the degree that it violates various individuals, large numbers of individuals' liberties. But I think it's a step in the right direction, certainly. So I'll agree with you to that extent. But I think it's important to note the difference between alienation of rights and choice to sort of not use your rights. I have freedom of speech, or at least I'd like to have freedom of speech. That does not commit me to always talking, and I think that to that extent, libertarians. I'm not a libertarian, but I find libertarian analysis, especially around lockdown, quite convincing. Have room to talk back to these kind of allegations by pointing out that we can choose to waive our freedom of association, and personally, but crucially it's a personal choice. And so I think that the government could have brought about similar goods during the second lockdown situation if they had given people, if people had simply chosen to waive their freedom of association, as I think you and I both doing, which is what we're doing is making an informed choice about how we will freely associate with individuals in light of scientific information that has been given to us by relevant authorities. And for me, I don't know about for you, that does mean I'm not going to underground raves or what have you. But I think that's important.
For the purpose of this video, I'm not going to underground raves. I'm not actually. I wouldn't. I seriously wouldn't. He knows that.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't anyway.
He might if it was not locked down.
I think this case, right, like, we could even imagine a society of libertarians under a harsher lockdown than we are now, solely through personal choice. And so I think it would be wrong to pastiche the libertarian account as saying no lockdowns. I think the key distinction is that for a libertarian or for a libertarian society, the kind of consequences of lockdown could be brought about by individuals making choices, informed choices about their associations.
The reason why I disagree with that is that I think society often and individuals are imperfect. And imperfect to the good degree which I don't think enough of them can make informed choices. And what's more, because we live in a society where individuals have to interact with each other to some extent, and have to interact with each other to some extent. I think by living in a society where there's a deadly virus which takes out 50% of us or something, just as an example, saying that this is just as an example to say that this is something that we need to avoid, that you can never get away from the fact that there is that risk that you will catch the virus if you live with a society of other individuals. In that I'm sort of basically saying that this idea of a society where you have the choice, everything, I think that the whole libertarian argument rests on this idea potentially that there is no level of interaction within society, and it also rests on the idea that potentially everyone is at equal risk of the virus, which I don't think they are. Like, the elderly and the vulnerable are obviously going to choose to isolate, but they cannot completely absolve themselves from the risk, because that's just not how society works, I don't think. So, I don't know, those are my two criticisms of the libertarian argument in this case, and I think libertarianism potentially more generally is that we do live in a society.
We do indeed live in a society.
Yeah, I think maybe one final question and then we'll end it, I think.
Yeah.
What does the vaccine mean? Does the vaccine change anything?
I think the vaccine can it can change a lot of things, and I think the first thing.
Hello? Sorry, you're cutting out a little bit.
You can make a metastasis much. So vaccine changes a huge number of things. Economically and politically, I couldn't say. I think we don't know yet, and I wouldn't, have the requisite information to start making those sorts of predictions. But in terms of our kind of moral situation, I think the vaccine changes a huge amount, because the common criticism of libertarians, right, is that they give us a fake choice. You can choose to hand your money over, or you can choose to be shot, and that's a free choice. When the choice becomes you can choose to take a vaccine and be free to interact with society, or you can choose to not take a vaccine and remain locked down, then I think we're given a really plausible way of generating the distinction I would have liked to have earlier. Because now we are, in a sense, targeting specific individuals for legitimate reasons, which is that they have made moral choices which have left them in a certain way more likely to cause harm. The problem I have right now with, say, a tier 3 lockdown or with track and trace is it takes blameless people who don't have COVID and so aren't at risk of harming anybody, and who aren't guilty of, living in Liverpool, and makes them, in some sense, subject to these violations of their liberties. If, however, a vaccine is circulated and made reasonably widely available, then it might be legitimate for us to say, you personally haven't taken a vaccine, you have made a moral choice which does leave you available to be subject to various restrictions and indeed lockdowns. So I'm very, very hopeful for a vaccine, not politically or economically. I don't know if it will be rolled out in sufficient quantity, but because I think it gives us a very plausible way of allowing us to make principled, moral and justified distinctions between individuals under COVID.
I think that's very interesting. I think that this gives me an opportunity to restate that botched distinction I did make earlier between your view and my view. When you say someone's guilty of living in Liverpool, what I would say is that I don't really care that they're living in Liverpool. If that's the way to save lives, to lock down Liverpool, for example, I want to do that because I think that acts in the common good. And I think that the government exists to promote the common good. I think what I would think I was trying to say earlier, but I didn't quite get it across directly enough, is that I think that you, in contrast to me, think that there's some sort of element of would I be right to think about individual rights in this case? I think that you think that individual rights play a far greater role in this than I do, because I think that government's for the common good, and you think that the government's for, I don't know exactly what you think the government's for, but you also think that potentially there's an added element where there needs to be some protection of people's rights.
Yeah, I think it would be worth saying I think the government is there not for the common good, but for the coordinating good. There are some goods which aren't good in themselves, but the fact that an example might be driving on one side of the road or the other, right? Like, clearly not a moral decision to drive on the left or the right, but a coordinating good in as much as it helps us pursue other goods and prevent, it's like there not being a bunch of road accidents.
Or
so
French.
I take your point
No offence, French
that the
people.
government promotes the good. I just think it's in a much, much more reduced sense than you seem to. I think it promotes nothing but, should at least promote nothing but, the coordinatory goods that help us on a personal individual level meet our moral responsibilities.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This has been Vijay Keshav. You can, say hello to him at Cambridge University. You can't at the moment, but he goes to Cambridge University. Making it to Oxbridge, where I couldn't make it to Oxbridge, so he's better than me. But Anyway, au revoir.
Au revoir. Thank you.